As you know, beloved listeners, I'm very accustomed to the finer points of interpretive dance, and I thought there might be something more that I could learn to expand my repertoire by gathering together a few experts in the field. I'm pretty interested to learn about an ongoing study which is exploring how professional dancers manage to tap this well of creativity and expression. Titled Thinking Brains and Bodies, this 3-year research project is investigating where creativity resides, the effect that collaboration has on creativity, and exactly what fosters group recollection. It began with the premise that thinking is not restricted to the brain of an individual, but can be distributed across a group, non-verbally. But while the art of dancing is the result of years of intensive training, is the kind of creativity which they tap into something accessible to everyone under the right conditions. I'm pleased to be joined now by Scott Delahunter. Scott is Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Dance Research at Coventry in the UK. Catherine Stevens, Kate is Professor of Psychology from the University of Western Sydney and is leading the study. And also flexing his thigh muscles, Garry Stewart, Director of the Australian Dance Theatre. We're having this little discussion backstage at the Adelaide Festival of Ideas, while outside young musicians are sitting for their exams. You might hear a little bit of that filtering through the walls. Kate, before we get stuck into this, would you be kind enough to explain to an ageing broadcaster the concept of embodied cognition?
Thank you, Philip. I will attempt to do so. So for many years, decades in fact, psychology was very interested in cognition, so mental processes. And I suppose for the last 15 or 20 years, there's been a recognition that there's a body involved with thinking as well. So the idea is that the brain is embedded in a body, and perhaps that body and action in particular influences those mental processes. So it's not just a disembodied brain, but something about action and perception are linked.
So what we're about to discuss might also, clearly would have applications, not only in dancing, but perhaps in sport and in yoga.
Exactly, and I think there's been an emphasis in cognitive psychology on thoughts as verbal. And of course, once you put the body into it and action in sport or yoga or in a creative context such as dance, then the intellectual aspect is embodied. It's bodily as well as neural and being able to be expressed in words.
Scott, how did you get involved in this whirligig?
Well, I had we were just discussing it. I have a dance background, but I also, and my interest was in making work. So I was a kind of an emerging choreographer in the late 1980s and 1990s. And I found myself organizing events for myself and colleagues where we would share creative process with an audience. So we would open up the studio doors and invite them in to see how we were making things. And I found myself really intrigued by that part of being able to engage an audience in the process rather than just the finished work. And I think that was the point at which I began to realize that I had a certain facility and an interest in that, doing that kind of thing.
Garry, are you aware that your body thinks as well as your mind?
Well, before I met Kate and sort of asked her about sort of doing this research with ADT, I'd made a work called Be Yourself in 2010, which was specifically about how selfhood is embodied, and sort of looking at sort of various theories on that in researching that project. Sort of, I think the kind of things that dancers know intuitively are being proven statistically and qualitatively and quantitatively through these studies. So I think it's, something that dancers instinctively kind of already know is being affirmed through science, which is really, really interesting for us.
And as I suspected earlier, it's something that could be extended to the athlete.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about dancers, if I can speak for dance, but perhaps beyond athletics, is dance requires extreme physiological dexterity and specificity, probably even beyond that of sport. The kind of the fine muscle coordination and also a relationship.
Well, a dancer does things with the body that no sportsman would contemplate.
Yeah, that's right. It's very, very specific. It's sort of greatly varying tempi, and also involving emotional and psychological states as well. So it's not just about performing physical actions, but there's also the conveyance of performativity.
Kate, let me quote you here. Dance is a non-verbal art form, but in the way it's created and performed, you've said, quote, it draws from deeply multimodal processes where sensation, perception, emotion and action are entangled in skills such as imagining, problem-solving, recollecting and communicating. Heavens above, what a burden.
And it happens in an instant. You know, it's happening in milliseconds. I think one of the things that is significant for a psychologist here is that the body is the instrument. So it's interesting being here in the conservatorium. We're seeing the cello and the violin coming in with the students, but of course the body is doing the expression, and it is an intelligent body. But you're right, it's drawing for inspiration, it's drawing on all of those modalities. Many people think dance is steps to music. One dances or moves to music. And I've learned from Garry, from ADT and from Scott and colleagues and companies around the world that contemporary dance can happen in silence. And so what inspires the creativity of that material? It can be a lilt, it can be a rhythm, it can be a visual image, it can be a poem, it can be language, but it can be drawing on all of those different kinds of senses that you've just captured.
Scott, forgive me for referring back to sport from time to time, particularly as I loathe and detest sport in all its forms. But how different is a group of dancers and what they do to a team of, for example, soccer players?
I think the difference really lies in the creative aspect. So the creativity that a dancer is invited to contribute to a process, in particular in contemporary dances, Kate's mentioned, and then also Garry, the dancers are really invited to be part of that creative process.
This is not the case in classical ballet, is it?
Less so. Let's say that you could make that difference, but classical ballet has pre-codified steps. A choreographer might arrange them in a certain sequence.
But with a very limited range of possibilities. If they go outside those terms of reference, the audience is deeply shocked.
That's true, and that has certainly happened in the past with the choreographer William Forsythe, for example, shocking ballet audiences and changing how ballet is perceived. But he was considered and also engaged his own performers in much more of the creative process. So that, for me, is one of the things that distinguishes most clearly a difference between sports and dance.
Kate, one of the results you found from hours of watching dancers was when you get two people interacting, you do not necessarily get twice as many ideas.
That's right. So it's there's a quantity there. We've tried to count and measure material that is generated by the dancers. This comes from an idea of brainstorming. Do I come up with more ideas when I'm sitting on my own, or do I have more ideas when I'm interacting with you, Philip? And we thought we would explore that in the studio. So it would be easy to say, well, put two people together, you'll get twice as much material. But no, you get qualitatively different material. Two dancers coming together provide so many more opportunities, potentials for what might be, because there are two bodies. We also manipulated whether those dancers often improvised together or whether that was a more unfamiliar pairing of dancers, and that makes some of a difference too. There's an exploration and a novelty with two unfamiliar dancers improvising together.
Garry, listening to this, I'm reminded of jazz.
Mm. Yeah, I'm kind of curious about what takes place subconsciously with dancers when they're performing. And we discussed this yesterday in the kind of debrief. This has been a 3-year study. And I thought, perhaps sort of the next step in looking at our dancers is the relationship within the frame of performance with an audience. So really an artwork, as far as I'm concerned, with dance, it's not really complete until it's in front of an audience. So it's this total gestalt system between the audience and the dancers. And dancers make or their bodies, their psyches make these decisions about performance on the fly. And it's really interesting because when you're performing, you are in this kind of like heightened fight or flight scenario, yet you're kind of, you're certainly not fleeing from the situation. So it's really interesting the kind of instantaneous creativity that happens under the performance pressure in relationship to the psychological presence of the audience. So,
is the audience
like
a
jazz.
performer in a sense, Scott?
Repeat that again, Philip, please.
Is the audience a performer in a sense? Do they also provide interaction?
I would say most definitely, following on what Garry has been describing, the performance situation, most performers expect that they will they'll reach their goals in a way only when they're in the environment where the audience is there. The presence of the audience kind of completes the picture. And you can, whereas I'm quite fascinated with what happens in the studio, and a lot of what we've been studying is what's happening in the studio. But when the work has been practiced over and over, it achieves a certain quality, and it's really only comes to its fruition in the presence of the audience.
I better explain why I am wearing my tutu here at the Adelaide Festival of Ideas. It's because I'm talking to Scott Delahunter, Senior Research Fellow, Centre for Dance Research at Coventry in the UK, to Catherine Stevens, Professor of Psychology from the University of Western Sydney, leading the study we're studying, and also Garry Stewart, Director of the Australian Dance Theatre. In the old psychology, we talk about brainstorming. You're talking about a physical form of brainstorming, Kate.
Yeah, Philip, we've been calling it body storming.
Body storming.
And so it's coming back to your concept of embodied cognition, that there is something collaborative happening when two or more dancers collaborate and work together in space.
Is it a form of telepathy, to borrow from another language?
There's certainly, in an earlier study, we talked about unspoken knowledge. There is certainly an understanding and a sharing of ideas between two bodies. There's an anticipation, particularly when one has been dancing with the other dancer over a long time. But I think there's a spontaneity that's perhaps not captured by a notion of telepathy that we see. It's creativity, it's freewheeling, it's fun, it's play, to maximise the creative output.
Well, this sort of improvisational make it up as you go along originality can go awfully wrong in jazz. Does it go wrong in dancing too, Garry? Are there times when it just doesn't work?
Yeah, I think, certainly dancers, when they're on stage performing, they come off at the end of the performance and they feel it was either a good performance or a bad performance. And, so sometimes they're on stage and they feel a certain flow and connection and they don't make any mistakes. And it just kind of like something happens beyond the thing that we just rehearsed in the rehearsal studio, we created in the rehearsal studio. Interestingly, though, as an observer, as being the choreographer in the audience, often when the dancers feel really bad about a performance and felt like it didn't quite work, as an observer and as the choreographer, I often feel the exact opposite. That was one of, I'll say that was one of the best performances you've done, and they're quite shocked. So there is this schism. But when I remember when I was a dancer, and I remember blanking once on stage, like I sort of forgot the steps for a few seconds. But what was interesting was my body just continued enacting the choreography as if nothing had happened. So something else took over for a few seconds, which was really, really convenient.
So there was a physical memory as opposed to a mental memory.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the kind of the repetition of rehearsals then sort of kicked in and my body just continued what I'd already been practicing.
I can see parallels between the choreographer and the film director. Some film directors insist that the actor absolutely does what they're bloody well told to do, where others encourage a certain amount of ad-libbing or innovation. You seem to have exactly the same view in regard to choreography.
Well, I think there are different approaches and different schools of thought on that, and varying degrees of all of them, and neither is right nor wrong. I think, as we talked about with ballet, conventionally ballet relies on a sort of a fairly strict structure where the choreographer comes into the studio and makes all of the steps, and so he is seen as the sort of the master of the work. A more contemporary approach is where we, as we've been discussing, share the creative process with the dancers and draw on their intelligence and experience and creativity into the manufacturing of the work.
This sounds like an absolutely stupid question, and I'm sure it is. Is it possible to have, in effect, a high mental IQ and a low physical IQ? Scott.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's... because I would say that in particular with the dancers that we have the good fortune to work with in Garry's company, for example, they clearly seem to have both at the same time. I suppose that I'd never heard of the physical IQ, a physical IQ being sort of described, but it's clearly the case.
But it just occurs to me.
Well, it's clearly the case that there would be, that there would be various levels of functioning, or if you remain within normative functioning, then there would be people who have struggled with coordination, or perhaps would have difficulty remembering the movements or something like that. But over time, practice might improve that. Of course. It's a very complex question, actually, though.
Well, let me follow it up with this, Scott. You have an experiment with long-term memory, and the challenge was how to get elite and brilliant dancers, high IQ dancers, to fail. What was the aim of that, apart from just cruelty?
Well, the aim of that comes more from the scientific side, how it is that Kate is thinking about probing the process of memory and recall, and that one of the ways from the scientific side to set up that study is to not see them succeeding all the time, but see where they fail. Yeah. So the challenge there, as you say, with dancers with such a high level of skill and ability, was to find ways that we could, in a way, experience them failing, because they so rarely do.
Well, let's toss it over to you, Kate.
So, it's very easy to do it. Most psychologists would be testing Psychology 1 students in the lab, and so it's very easy to give them novel materials and observe their memory failing and looking at the patterns of failure under different conditions. So we set it up as a challenge, or, involve the dancers in helping us to work out an experimental design that would pick up on their memory successes, but also their failures. So it was a challenge.
But you found it damned hard, didn't you? The dancers simply wouldn't fail.
Indeed. And I had this built on a study that I'd done some years before with 3 dancers. One of them hadn't danced the material for 30 years, and she was still able to produce it. So
but
yes,
this is where
very,
we
very
get into
good.
this other area. It was clear that they distribute memory across other members of the company.
So in addition to the cognition being embodied, it is distributed. It is situated. It's influenced by the context in which those memories are laid down, but it's also it's collaborative, and it's distributed around the group. It's not solely within a single skull. So we had conditions where the dancers were split into teams, and they would try to think up challenges, memory challenges for their counterparts in the other team, and we would manipulate whether they were recalling, trying to remember the material alone, or whether they would do it as a duet, something that they had performed together. And you could see in the duet, that there was some Scott has just been looking at this data. You can see that there is some advantage to having another there, because the bit that I'm lapsing in, the other dancer is filling in and triggering. So there's more output, if you like, with the duet than the solo dancer. Is that a fair take?
Scott, you've undertaken experiments to map the course of creativity. You're finding when and where ideas happen.
That's the experiment that David Kirsch from the University of California, San Diego has been set up in collaboration with the dancers, and his interest is in looking at the productivity the range of productivity that might occur across different timescales. So if you give somebody 15 minutes to create novel material, or if you give them 30, or if you give them 45 minutes, and at what point is there sort of have they reached their peak capacity in creative terms, or when is it that some of that begins to tail off? And that was his interest in trying to chart that time course of creativity.
Now, I've got a paradoxical note here, Kate. You found out that the more you spend time being creative might make you less creative. That's a daunting and depressing thought.
Well, it's an empirical question, isn't it? It's probably a question from the point of view of productivity. I mean, it's we also have some qualitative data from that experiment. And one dancer observed, and she hadn't realised this, she's a 10-minute kind of a person. She has these bursts of creativity in 10-minute spans, and that's kind of her span. She has a break and then has another 10 minutes. So there's, just as you were talking about intelligence in a way, there are individual differences here. So for that dancer, she has a particular pattern of working, and she, through the experiment, I think, realised her pattern of productivity. For others, one other dancer said 15 minutes was great to stimulate ideas, but to really develop those ideas and to put kind of flesh on the bones of an idea, she needed something like 45 or way more than 45 minutes.
As we talk, the mind keeps playing its usual tricks, and I'm thinking of all the areas in which the body knows and doesn't require the brain to think. Riding a bike comes to mind. Driving comes to mind. There's a whole host of activities. Creativity and innovation are the buzzwords in employment these days. Does this study have any applications here? I'll put that to you, Garry.
Well, creativity and innovation are absolutely central to what we do. It's kind of the sort of raison d'etre, if you like, for contemporary performance. Making contemporary dance is a high-risk activity because we enter into every project not really knowing what the outcome's going to be, because the whole basis of it is to push boundaries and enter into something that's a mystery that we then uncover. So there's a lot of risk involved, as there is in any innovation, in any product or any endeavour. And fundamentally, it's also a creative act. We're not regurgitating something that we already know. We have a body of knowledge, but we're also trying
a body of knowledge.
A body of knowledge, which is a
phrase in the context
that we're trying to extend on with every project.
It's a very, very interesting area. And I wasn't sure whether I was going to enjoy this discussion, given my own total inability to do anything physical. But this is really, really intriguing. Where is it heading?
I think.
Yeah, go on, Scott. You have it.
I think that one of the things we really set out to do is to create a collaborative relationship between the science researchers and the dance researchers, and really bringing them into the project as researchers, trying to shift a little bit some of the assumptions that people have about science, observing the dancers as subject. And so in a way, some of what has been most exciting about this project is to sort of shift the perception of the nature, where intelligence lies. Is it purely physical intelligence in dance? Well, we can say a lot about why it's not purely physical intelligence, things like that.
Are you able to plug into some of the neurological sciences and look at brain activity directly?
We haven't done that as part of this project, Philip. There are, just as we're talking about embodied cognition, there is a part of cognitive neuroscience very interested in joint action. So two people synchronising and working together in time. We're just, in the institute that I work in at Western Sydney University, we have a dual EEG setup. So you can start to record using surface electrodes, the neural activity as two people are synchronising, playing piano duets. At the moment, there are wireless systems, but often there are wires, which is not ideal for the dance studio. But that's not too far away.
I would have thought there'd be an explosion of colour if you were able to observe this in real time.
Indeed, for the multimodal kind of aspect that you mentioned earlier. Indeed.
Well, some of the challenges with neuroscience is the amazing new technique now for picturing the brain. The fMRI machine requires you not to move at all. So when you go into fMRI, there's no movement possible. And that's one of the challenges with measuring anything that's happening in the brain with a dancer who's moving so much. But some of the new technologies are sort of beginning to break away from that and enable those sorts of images to be obtained when people are moving more. And I think we would see potentially in the future quite a lot of development in that area.
Garry, I would have thought that fear is a constant problem for a dancer. Can I do it? Will I remember? Am I going to fall over on stage?
Yeah. I think there's a constant monologue that dancers have, an interior monologue that's surrounding fear and fear of failure, which is kind of ingrained in their training in some ways because you're training, particularly, for example, in classical ballet technique, you're training in a technique that can never, ever be performed absolutely 100% perfectly. You know, you're sort of trying to attain something that is unattainable. So, and often you spend most of your days looking at yourself in the mirror. So there is a sort of lot of judgment and fear. And one of the ways in which we've addressed that in the company is through introducing meditation. So a number of years ago, we invited a Buddhist monk to come in and take the dancers through Buddhist practice in meditation, analytical meditation, and also just mindfulness. And that really, I think, transformed the company quite a bit. It gave the dancers a language for addressing their own fear and judgment, and also the judgment of their peers and the situation that they're working in. So I think that's sort of been really, really handy.
Scott, another area where one is conscious of the drama of being a dancer is that you also have to work through pain. And then all dancing traditions, pain is a huge issue.
Well, there's been a lot of progress in that area in the last, also drawing on sports science and sports medicine. So there's been quite a lot of development. So dancers are much more attuned to how, and Gary's mentioned meditation, but you're also involving the dancers in careful forms of training and body awareness that help to, but it's, but the aging body, so the changing body, the condition of being so engaged physically absolutely comes with, having to accommodate that on a day-to-day basis. As
we know, Kate, one of the ways of improving performance in sport is with certain, shall we say, performance-enhancing drugs. Is that something which is contemplated in dance?
For the purpose of creativity, maybe.
Yeah.
I have never asked that question.
I've never asked that question either.
Well, look at poets, look at writers of all sorts, artists.
I have to say, having worked with the company, it's addictive in and of itself. It really is.
I remember seeing dancers were often very heavy smokers, but that was to keep the weight down, I suspect. Look, thank you. I've learnt a lot today, and I'm going to dance out of the studio and keep my knees and hips such as they are thinking. Scott Delahunter, Senior Research Fellow, Centre for Dance Research at Coventry University, UK. Kate Catherine Stevens, Professor of Psychology from the University of Western Sydney, leading the study. And Garry Stewart, Director of the Australian Dance Theatre. And thanks, Scott, Kate, Garry.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philip.